Doing pharmaceutical R&D is actually quite complex and requires domain expertise from many areas.
Of the items that were highlighted were create vision, remove blockers, and be a coach.
On using AI to solve a very difficult problem of protein folding.
Welcome to our very last In Conversation With event for 2020. My name is Gaurav Tomar, and I serve as the Chief Marketing Officer at German Indian Business Forum, or GIBF in short. In my day job, I work as an automotive industry manager at MathWorks, who are the makers of MATLAB and Simulink, the tools which are used by engineers and scientists all over the world. GIBF organizes this annual German Indian Business Forum in Munich, together with support of Government of India, Bavarian Ministry of Economic Affairs, the City of Munich, Confederation of Indian Industries, and German Asia Pacific Business Association. We've been doing this since past 5 years, and early on this year we decided to spread out the events across the year and not as we do usually, which is 2 to 3 days physical event, usually in the third quarter of the year. So In Conversation With is one of the events that we conducted throughout this year, where we've invited industry leaders, startup founders, and investors to learn about what the in-focus topics for this year's forum, which were smart logistics and mobility, but also to learn about the new areas of application of the new technologies like AI. We spoke about that last time when we were speaking about cybersecurity, and we invited Madeline Shea from UK to join us and speak to us about cybersecurity. Today, we'll take a deep dive on the pharmaceutical side, and we have with us Dr. Subodh Deshmukh, who's joining us from Munich. He is the global product head for Sandoz, which is a Novartis company. Subodh, welcome to German Business Forum, and welcome to In Conversation With event.
Gaurav, thank you so much for having me. Really happy to be here. Looking forward to our hour together.
Yeah, thank you. And Subodh, so let's kick off the conversation with a bit about yourself. So you have been leading teams of more than 1,000 people, 1,000 associates, where they are carrying out integrated product development of generic and differentiated products across the world. You are also overseeing strategy, performance, and R&D teams, including clinical, medical, and technical, also regulatory domains. Can you give us a bit of background into what your journey has been like?
Yeah, happy to do that. And quite simply, I would say I ended up in the healthcare space by accident. So that's the simplest way to say it. I trained as an engineer, as a chemical engineer, and as a material scientist. And it was just that out of graduate school, my work, which was about molecular assembly of materials, was an area of interest in pharmaceutical R&D. And that has led me to get into and then have a very fruitful career in healthcare and particularly in pharmaceuticals, also keeping close to my passion for R&D and engineering. And, you referred in the introduction to the different domains that I oversee. Well, I think one reason for that is doing pharmaceutical R&D is actually quite complex and requires domain expertise from many areas. And that's not different from other high-tech areas, but it's particularly challenging, I think, because we're trying to solve the puzzles of nature and evolution and human biology, which are quite complex. And in fact, it's very typical for me to have meetings where I'm surrounded by 8 or 10 people with PhDs in different disciplines. That's what it takes today to bring a pharmaceutical product to market. So the other thing I would say is, I've been fortunate to just live and work in different parts of the world. So I was educated in India with my bachelor's degree. I grew up there, and also in the US, where I did my graduate work. And then I worked and lived in the US and also in Asia, and now happy to be living in Munich in Europe. So that's also been a part of my career all these years.
That's very, very exciting. And also, I completely agree with the fact that the cross-domain knowledge that is required in pharma is probably unparalleled with any other industry. I have automotive background, and I'm involved with autonomous driving efforts in automotive. So that's also an area where this cross-domain know-how is required, and we can dive deeper on that, especially on the AI topic later in the conversation. So very interesting. Thank you. So being a healthcare insider, and we don't want to harp on it too much because there's a lot of information available in the media online already. But it wouldn't be right if we don't address the elephant in the room right off the bat. So being an industry insider, could you maybe give us some insight on how this mammoth project of creating a vaccine came about? And I think this was unparalleled, right? Within 7 to 8 months, or maybe 9 months, we already have 3 different vaccines which have followed 3 different courses or phase of development. So could you give us a bit more insights on what your perspective is, how these things were managed, these projects were managed?
So I can certainly share what I know, Gaurav, and you're right that this is unprecedented. In fact, today we have the first formal approval for the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine by the UK government. Okay. And so we can say officially one of the vaccines is actually approved. But as you know, the others are also under review. I understand the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines are being submitted to the US FDA for approval. And all 3 lead vaccines have got some level of phase 3 data about their efficacy and safety already revealed to the public. So this is indeed major progress. I mean, if you think about it, in 8 or 9 months, we have from knowing next to nothing about this disease, COVID-19, which started out as something akin to a flu, but now we know is about 5-fold more deadly than the typical annual influenza epidemic, and has led to over 1 million lives lost already. So from knowing nothing to having a vaccine that hopefully will be able to immunize most at-risk people pretty soon is indeed major progress. But let's also take a step back and say, hey, the vaccine is where we are today. But already to get here, we had a couple of steps of innovation that happened. So first, I think the first days, I would say, was a fog of war. Doctors and healthcare systems didn't know how to treat people with symptoms of COVID. And the first immediate need was basics like PPE and life-saving medicines, for example, for emergency rooms. And that's where companies like my company, Sandoz, played a big role, because we are the largest suppliers of hospital medicines in Europe, for example, and one of the largest suppliers of antibiotics or anti-infective medicines across the world. And this is what's needed to make your hospitals and your emergency rooms running. So we had to first secure that, and that was not easy because the world was starting to go into lockdown. So there's a lot of innovation that happened there. Second, we started to look for drugs that could help fight COVID from what we already had. So that you may have heard there were efforts with hydroxychloroquine, HCQ, which was the sort of the first wave based on some published reports. And also, we were both trying to balance bringing solutions for doctors to use, but at the same time also making it science-based. And I would say that there were some false starts in that process. Many medicines were tried and turned out that they worked partially or didn't work. And then we had breakthroughs like Remdesivir, which was the first emergency use authorization that was and then later approved as a new treatment for COVID-19.
Right, and Remdesivir is actually a very, very interesting piece here in the story, right? Because it was predicted, so it was more of a designed drug using AI, right?
Actually, not so much Remdesivir. Remdesivir is a drug that was brought forward by Gilead, a U.S. antiviral specialist company. And they had already been investigating it for other viral diseases. So the application to COVID was the leap that they made and gave data. I think what's unique about Remdesivir is that once we saw the first clinical data showing that it worked in randomized controlled trials, Gilead made the wise move of making the licenses for producing Remdesivir available to companies worldwide, including manufacturers in Europe, in Asia, including in India and China, for very minimal licensing fees. And that allowed the world supply chain to start making Remdesivir. So in fact, today, if you go to far-flung parts of the world, you will find that Remdesivir might be available in hospitals for emergency use for COVID. And what's interesting about that is this is a patent-protected drug that typically the originator company would want to not give out its technology. But in this case, knowing that the pandemic was raging, this was the best thing to do. So this is also, to me, an innovation to bring it quickly to folks that need it.
Yeah, and this is a big pivot from how usually drugs are developed, patented, and then marketed in pharma, right? So there's 10-year, 20-year lock-in.
It's a well-known story that it takes upwards of $2 billion to develop a new molecular entity, and therefore there is always a vested interest from the company that innovates that to kind of capture revenues once it is marketed. And so it's in fact one of the very few industries where there is a legalized monopoly allowed. So there's a patent life of 20 years typically, varies a little bit depending on exact circumstances, which is given to the originator company. And in this case, we had to look beyond that. And I think there have been very few instances in the past. The HIV pandemic was one where maybe similar measures were taken. But again, I think this is also important for all of us to note.
True. Yeah. Thank you. So that's quite also interesting because my quite a lot of my friends are working for big names in Switzerland and Germany on the pharma side. So it's always interesting to know the other side, how the work happens. And I think, yes, it was quite path-breaking for Remdesivir and the parent company to actually open up and share. So it's for common good, but then also in the process, they are not hurting themselves and securing themselves as well. So if we talk about technology, so how is technology being embraced right now in drug development, especially in context of COVID, but also generally? So we've all seen these advertisements that on television in Germany, where they've broken down in layman terms how the mRNA drug works with emoticons, etc. So what's the story behind it? So why mRNA, and does this method exist theoretically for long and wasn't applied until now? If yes, then what changed? So why is it now suddenly applicable?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, I think COVID has been an accelerator for innovation in that sense.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So if you think about it, vaccines for diseases like influenza, but also for other diseases, have been made typically by using attenuated live cultures. That was typically how it was done. So for that, you had to culture the organism and grow it and then inject it. This process takes a long time. And also developing this process when you don't have a good handle on the specific virus in this case was quite difficult. What companies like BioNTech, which is, of course, as you know, a Germany-based company, and actually a phenomenal success story because this came right out of academia. So it's a typical example of a biotech started by a highly regarded professor from the University of Mainz, and really deeply, involved in the frontiers of RNA technology, which was still, not quite in the limelight. And as COVID hit, there was a rush for solutions, and it turned out that with RNA technology, you could take a piece of the viral RNA, the one that specifically codes for this spike protein, which is on the surface of the virus. And if you could do that, you could then inject that into the human body. The human cellular system can replicate and make that RNA get recognized and therefore have antibodies to the spike protein. So while it was, this concept was quite theoretical until now, and this gave an opportunity to try it out. And BioNTech really seized that opportunity.
Understood.
They designed a drug literally in weeks, which is also unheard of. And it was accelerated. One of the other smart things that they did is they partnered with big established pharma, with Pfizer, so that development ultimately does take a lot of deep expertise that goes far beyond the labs and allows you to do clinical studies. Even in this case, for the BioNTech Pfizer vaccine, the final phase of clinical studies was done with 40,000 plus volunteers. And so that massive logistical exercise, plus the collaboration between the large established pharma scientists and the startup, really made it happen. Similarly, a smaller company also in the US, Moderna, did a similar approach with their own mRNA technology. And interestingly, if you dig deeper, you'll find that the origin of both these mRNA technologies comes from university work done actually in my alma mater at the University of Pennsylvania in the US. So again, it's a classical example of academic research translating into eventually industrialization, but done in a much faster pace, and of course in public limelight.
Right. And under immense scrutiny as well, right?
Exactly. I think that many did not believe that this could happen, that a mRNA-based vaccine would even work. So going through the stages of not only having it work, but seeing the efficacy that we now see is just phenomenal.
What? So One more question.
Just to
go ahead.
complete the thought,
Sure.
so I think the takeaway for everybody, who's interested should be that beyond the vaccine for COVID, this really provides a platform technology that now can be used for other vaccines, other diseases, going far, far beyond, influenza or viral infections into many different therapeutic applications. And to me, that is the big win from this, the clouds of the pandemic, that we will have made this big leap in technology.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so one would also question, why was it not, why did we need a pandemic to try out mRNA? So it's a type of administration of a personalized medicine, right? So personalized medicine has been, the concept has been there for a long time. So has this never been tried before, or are there fringe cases or smaller cases where it was tried and tested and it worked, but the disease is not that widespread that people got to know about it?
Yeah. Well, personalized medicine as a general area is a very broad area, and it's really about being able to understand the specific application that is needed to treat a particular individual. And I think that there is tremendous progress in the broad area of personalized medicine. Specifically, though, technologies like RNA technologies are emerging from the decoding of the human genome, because these are essentially genomics-based technologies. Right. And you're right that the first adaptation has been in what are called rare diseases, where there is a very clear understanding of a genetic mutation that leads to a certain condition. Understood. And typically, this is true for diseases with a small patient population, but very clear one-to-one linkage. And the question is then, can you repair those genes? And there are many recent advances of drugs approved that are called gene therapies to address this, and that's a form of personalized medicine, including some groundbreaking drugs from my company Unbossed in that area. Now, what's different though for RNA technology specifically is that it does allow you to look at a part of a messenger system to code DNA. And siRNA technology has been also recently been successful after many, many years of research, where there are now commercially approved drugs for certain conditions like spinal muscular atrophy. But mRNA itself was not quite in the limelight until now. And so now I think is really the big step forward for RNA technology. And I think there is tremendous opportunity, because this is really the coding of the human system that is allowed, that's responsible for creating proteins and making our bodies work. So there's a lot of potential there.
And especially also for, so there's a lot of chatter about adopting mRNA or RNA technology to cancer research and cancer drugs. So probably hoping to have more developments there. There are a few audience questions that have come in, so let me squeeze in one or two of those. So there's a question from Dr. Prajakta. In case, now that we are speaking of finances, rather huge finances involved behind this vaccine production and creation, so the whole scaling up mechanism, how to do changing virus scenarios with companies and common man. Okay, so I think the question is about a mutation of the virus. So how would now that we have this vaccine, which is quite tailored to the virus, if the virus mutates, how does the vaccine adapt to that, or how agile is it?
It's a great question. I mean, I'm definitely not a virologist or a specialist in that space. I can imagine that potentially with sufficient mutation, the vaccine's ability would weaken, but we don't know. It's too early for COVID to be able to say how effective the vaccine will continue to be. I think we have to understand that this is the first step to try to get into an immunization. But the hope here is that this technology and our understanding is only improving. So potentially it allows us more tools to fight any potential mutations and so on going forward.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But yes, I think this research and this work needs to continue to as we monitor, what happens to the virus.
Right. And I think a few other questions are also kind of connected to this, or actually a follow-up of the discussion we were having about technology of RNA. Because this has been a theoretical concept and there wasn't a scale big enough to try it out. Now we've tried it out. Is there guidance, at least in academics, about what could be the possible side effects or just long-term effects of such a way of administering a drug to the human body in the long run?
Yeah, so great question. Actually, we don't know the long-term effects. There is a lot to be still understood, particularly for certain diseases. There are many drugs in clinical stages or in the labs, and over time, this knowledge base will increase.
Right.
There is clearly some concern that there could be long-term effects of having an RNA fragment injected into your cellular system, and it is replicated essentially within the human body and is creating protein instead of ex vivo, which is typically done in what are called MABs or monoclonal antibodies. So this is new, but I think that as we use the technology, we will know more. And I think that we have to also take the scientific approach and ensure that there's robust clinical study, there is randomized controlled clinical trials before new medicines are brought forward.
Right. And one should not forget that these permissions that are being given right now, these are provisional. These are permissions given under emergency circumstances, and these are not general approvals for the vaccine. Right? It's more of the applications are made under provisions for pandemic and emergency situations.
Right.
Okay. So there was one more drug.
My general advice though on this would be to really follow the guidance from your healthcare provider and your healthcare system. So I think there are going to be questions that people will have about getting vaccinated, but I think the approach here is that in total it's a positive for people to get immunized, and that's how we should look at it. But certainly you should follow the advice from your local healthcare organization and healthcare providers.
Thank you, Subodh. This is very exciting, actually, but also with long-term effects, both, and we don't know how positive or how negative. So, yeah. There was another drug.
Can I add? I mean, there has been. Sorry, one. I've seen
go ahead.
WhatsApp messages and so on about the dangers of the mRNA vaccine. There's been a lot of, I think, unfounded stories circulated. So I'm a bit concerned that sometimes we have this conversation on a non-scientific basis. So I would very much direct anybody who has questions about the vaccine or the vaccine technology to the government healthcare authorities, where I think there is a lot of research, in the US, for example, with the FDA or the CDC, similarly in Europe with the EMA, And that should be a safe place to get advice. But to not just believe, unfounded theories online.
Yeah, as we say that in layman terms, WhatsApp University. So don't believe in that. So I think that's a very, very valuable advice. And are these research papers usually are these publicly available, or can we just go on FDA or CDC or IMA website and look for those, or are these only? Okay.
Absolutely. The basic guidance would be available for sure.
Yeah.
So I would very much, suggest that you go to to the websites and just look at the information there.
Okay. So there you have it. So because there are actually quite a lot of concerned questions in that direction. So I think you addressed that already. There was another drug which was talked about a lot and is being talked about a lot is Dexamethasone. That also has an interesting story behind it, right? So could you maybe shed some light on that?
Yeah, and it is true that Dexamethasone, has proven to have significant positive effect in highly sick and hospitalized patients. It was also famously used to treat the U.S. president when he was sick and in hospital. So Dexamethasone is a well-known and well-established corticosteroid. And steroids essentially play the role of reducing inflammation, but also have significant side effects because they can have other systemic effects as well. Now, to me, the interesting part about using Dexamethasone is that it was discovered, and it's an example of what is called repurposing. So this is a well-known drug that was approved and in use for something else and was then used for fighting COVID. And one of the big lessons from the pandemic is the potential opportunity with repurposing. And this is interesting because we may have approved, cheap, easy to produce medicines, and they could be useful for treating certain conditions. We just don't know that's possible. So how do you go about searching for it? Now, COVID again gave a platform because there was a desperate hunt for drugs. And obviously, it was easier to look for drugs that were already approved because in that case, you have already studied the safety and have a lot of data, including about how to manufacture, how to control. So that was the incentive, and some companies did some very pioneering work. So in the case of Dexamethasone, it was essentially based on a gut feel, based on medical clinical practice, right? And then there was a controlled clinical study done in the UK to prove that it works and it has benefit, and then that's how it was recommended. There are other examples which are even more fascinating because there are limits to how human understanding and manual searching. So that's where artificial intelligence has been deployed. And a company named Benevolent AI, also based in the UK, ran massive parallel searches, again, looking at the surfaces of the proteins that were expressed by the virus and looking to see how those could be blocked. And when that was done, one of the hits was baricitinib, which is an approved drug used for rheumatoid arthritis. And this drug proved to be effective. Today it is in clinical studies. And to me, what's unique then is if it does work and get approved eventually for treating COVID, it would be a real breakthrough where a completely artificial intelligence-based system has been able to search and find it. And again, the neat part here is that it opens the door to doing this now many more times. So you could do it for different conditions, different diseases, and really, you have the potential of coming up with treatments much faster and also potentially much cheaper, which is again of great importance to the healthcare systems.
So that's right. So that's the second unprecedented thing that has taken place, right? So first was this use of RNA technology, and the second is this opening of the floodgates in its most positive sense of future into AI-driven repurposing of drugs, which are already in the market and easier to produce. So great.
Absolutely. And for those interested, I would just say, just Google repurposing, and you can get publications of the work done by Benevolent AI. Interestingly, there's also a very recent, as of this week, publication from DeepMind, which is a unit of Alphabet, the big Google parent company, on using AI to solve a very difficult problem of protein folding, which is a very important step in understanding what drug targets to go after. And apparently now this is also solvable purely by AI. So you combine these things with repurposing, and you really are looking at deploying AI and machine learning at a much, much bigger scale than was previously possible to finding drugs and repurposing drugs.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating, actually. Let's take a audience question. It's taking like as Navjot Singh Sidhu says, like a taximeter. Lots of interesting questions. So Pranav is asking, can you please tell us what's the difference between the difference that you see in the way forward in biotech spheres and probably the greater regulatory focus when we move ahead from the COVID situation? And this question is in context of the RNA-based vaccines. So do we have any, because it's completely new, so I would imagine there isn't any regulatory framework as such for it, right? So is that already kicked off in parallel? What's happening there?
Well, to my knowledge, there is actually a tremendous collaboration with industry, academia, governments to have the right framework for rapid assessment and then eventually approval of these therapies. So as an example, when the protocols for these trials for vaccines had to be put in place, they were done with consultation with the health authorities because of the some of the new questions and challenges. This was the right approach. So there's prior agreement on what minimum effectiveness would you need and what happens if there's an adverse event. And it was all monitored carefully so that you could run trials, but also have the benefit risk such that you could see the benefits relatively quickly. So on December 10th, there is a FDA advisory committee meeting, which is open to the public, by the way, where a lot of the scientific and regulatory issues will be discussed for the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. So if those who are interested, I highly recommend that you can log in. You can find the exact details on the website of the US FDA. And similarly, there will be more such forums and meetings. But my one understanding from what I see is there's actually a lot of support from regulators to work together with industry to make this happen. And I can share an example from my own world. One of the things that happened in Europe is that when there are needs for having a medicine supplied to different countries, then you need country-specific labels, that is use instructions. This is done as a matter of course, and sometimes it involves simple things like just translating the label. But that's necessary to supply medicines, even in a geographic area like Europe. Now, when the pandemic hit, you suddenly had shortages of a medicine in one country, but it was available in another country. And one of the things we proposed to the European Regulatory Authority is, could we not transition to electronic labels where we could update the labels in real time, and patients would get and physicians would get the information that they need, but it would allow us to move supplies faster from one place to another, especially where it's needed. Whereas typically it took 30 days plus, now it could be done in 2 days or less. And this was something that the FDA or the EMA piloted quickly as part of COVID. And now I think there's a potential to roll this out broader. So I think there's a lot of receptivity to doing things differently, also using more digital tools, which was not maybe so easily possible earlier.
And I think that you already kind of answered a question that just came in about do you foresee some business models evolving, some new business models evolving specifically in the industry after COVID? And I think you kind of answered that. So, for example, digital labels and the whole infrastructure behind it would be something that people who are interested in this kind of business could look into and have a AI-driven translator, which then translates the labels, for example. So you wouldn't really need to create them from scratch.
We are even potentially transitioning to an app that allows a patient or a physician to be able to scan a barcode, and be able to see the relevant information that goes even far beyond what is today in a printed label, for example.
Yeah, so that's where the connect between the pharma companies on one hand and the HPCs on the other. So this tight connect even can be strengthened and made quicker. Yeah,
absolutely. And there are many other examples, particularly of lessons learned from COVID. I can tell you in my world, as you mentioned, we have 1,500 team members spread around the world, from China to India to Europe, US, and Canada, working on doing new product development. And of course, there is a clear impact of COVID on labs and how you can work in labs. So we are moving to far more automation and overall use of in silico tools, so more modeling and simulation, and ability to experiment in silico and do less physical experimentation. And these are areas that were of interest already, but are becoming certainly highly accelerated now.
That's and I'm smiling.
Tools like, we are already using AR technologies, for example. So augmented reality gives the opportunity for somebody to be in a physical lab or near a machine without actually being there. And earlier, it may have been a nice to have, but it is now quickly becoming a must have, because we need to keep running and keep doing R&D despite restrictions, right? And
exactly.
So this is, to me, also a big change in how we do business.
Yeah, and this is another answer to the question that came in about business opportunities and also how digital is being embraced in pharma. So I can certainly imagine AR plus robotics being used, so more of a autonomous machine-assisted laboratory where you can kind of remotely do your experiments. And
so I can give you an example. In our network, we have this year one fully automated laboratory that operates 24/7 without human intervention. And the idea is, it took us, let's say, 3 years to get to this stage, but the idea would be to replicate that much faster and have it.
Right. And I was smiling earlier because this is exactly the trend that we are seeing in automotive as well, right? And since, let's say, for about last 5 years, this trend of virtualizing testing is being picked up because you need to scale up. So with more and more software in the cars, you need to test that software more quickly, and that's where the need for virtually being able to test is coming in. So it's very similar to what's happening in automotive and what has already been done in other industries. So it's interesting to see that it's picking up here in pharma as well. One of the things before I let you go, I know we are up against the clock, is Unbossed. So I saw this hashtag when I was looking at Sandoz website. I also saw this on Novartis website. There are some blog posts from Sandoz CEO and also Novartis CEO talking about Unbossed, talking about servant leadership and this culture shift or cultural mandate in the company. So could you maybe talk about that? What is Unbossed all about?
So in a nutshell, it's really the modern leader who needs to be able to channel the organizational energy, not by being hierarchical and authoritative. This is a model that needs to evolve from, let's say, the 1950s assembly line, manufacturing related model to today's knowledge economy. And Unbossed maybe captures it all in one word. It's a complicated concept, so I think it's also a controversial term. But to me, it's about the leader being a coach, the leader being a person who helps shape the vision, but is also really the person removing obstacles in the path of the team, who provides clarity and lets the team and the individuals in the team reach their best potential. And so how is the servant leadership, which is not to be necessarily seen at the front of the pack always, but to be at the back, to be supportive, to be coaching, and so on. So there are certain concepts. Right. For those who are interested, I would really recommend the book from Lars Koland, which is called Unbossed, which sort of originated this word. I think at the base of it, it's not rocket science or completely revolutionary principles. In fact, many of the principles go down to sort of Indian philosophy of being mindful, taking time, coaching, being the guide, sort of the relationship that Krishna and Arjun have, for example.
Right. Very, very fascinating note to actually culminate our conversation. Also, just a top up on that, there was a Google project which ran for, I think, multiple years on leadership, and they were investigating, do they really need management, or do they really need managers, like classic managers? And that was the problem statement. And I think some of the findings are online, where they also then talk about, yes, we do, but they need to do these things. And one of the items that were highlighted were create vision, remove blockers, and be a coach. So Subodh, thank you very much. This has been very, very exciting conversation. Also, that we overshot the time shows that it was very exciting. The questions have been ticking in. I hope everyone got some of your questions answered. And as Subodh said, please inform yourself, read through FDA and other websites. They are informing us in a very transparent fashion. Also, the German government is doing that and informing us how the drug works, why it is a good idea to take it, and also the ethics committee that has been set up is again a very good step from the German government side to decide who gets the vaccine first and how it should be dispersed into the general public. So, Subodh, thank you very much once again for joining German Indian Business Forum. From everyone here in the forum team, thank you to the audience for supporting us throughout the year, everyone who took part in our events. And we'll, of course, be back next year with the second round of, or new round of events. Thank you very much for your attention, and bye for now. Stay safe.